Hello, once again, this is Matt Meyer, Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association. Very pleased that we're once again able to present live on the YouTube channel of IPRA the fact that we have a plenary tonight. This plenary, beginning probably at 5:45 or at 6 o'clock. No, it'll be closer to 5:45, I think, and I hope, is going to be on questions of strategies and tactics, revolutionary nonviolence, revolution and nonviolence, decolonization in movements of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Howeida Araf from Palestine, Marcela Agudela from Colombia, Wendy Marshall, an incredible activist from Philadelphia, Mark Lance, philosophy professor from Georgetown, and I will all be speaking on this panel. So stay tuned. Get your coffee or tea or soft drinks or water, and stay tuned. We'll be there soon.
It's Mark.
One end or the other.
Whatever you say.
Listen. Huh?
Because you don't need to do something right away because I'm actually
I know, but really, yes, he'll do that. Who's here is here.
I need to get the slides.
The Marcella thing, the slide thing is the next priority.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, I see.
And I coming back.
We should
Starting,
I
Matt.
think most people.
Matt, when are you starting?
I'm hoping in 10 minutes.
I mean, there was a
That's fine.
not like a bunch of universities chipped in.
Make sure Marceline.
A few hundreds from several.
Yeah, I got it.
As far as I know, it's not affiliated. Matt, what is asking? Where does IPRA funding come from? Is it mostly just individuals?
Yeah. Hold on one second. Okay.
Yeah. So you can just ignore me for a second, Wendy. I was speaking to someone else. Oh, shoot.
Okay. I think I'm back to the first.
I have an issue right now. I'm sorry. I need to take care of this first. It's not going to send me a text message. Did we see that you think? Okay. I need to get into my drive because Marcella and my issue with Marcella. I can download it to my phone. Okay. What time is this starting? It's supposed to start in 10 minutes. Okay. We have plenty of time. I got it. It's fine. I got it.
I taught this book twice.
Hold on. I found.
Yeah, it's a really good collection. No, you can grab it on
The other year, I saw all the rest as very expensive. Some of them are okay because I'm not.
For service.
Huh? So, oh, you don't know her? Okay. Yes, because I know all of you. It's very complicated when you reject my saying you should get it out of to me, which I do that. So it's really hard. Wendy, you can't see me, but I'm the black screen. No, right, you can't see me. They can? Just to they're pretty good fucks as well. Huh? Okay, I heard that part. Okay, stop. This is such a huge topic.
No, I muted it. I muted it because there's so much. I muted it just because there's just so much back and forth.
So just to be clear, we're going to probably begin in about 10 minutes or so. A few tech things as always. And then we'll be beginning it.
Or it's fine. Does it need to be a double screen? Matt.
Yeah.
Okay, I heard my name.
Okay. Do we need to like when I got it? I got it.
I'm so glad.
Oh, I just made it. I'm just making the decision.
I'm really upset. I knew that.
Yeah. I want to make it safe.
Okay, this is the last section. Segregated.
Sí, igual mi médico me dijo, de hecho, como tendrías que tomar un antibiótico más fuerte, pero eso sí es esencial, pues, lo único que,
Sorry about waiting. Thanks.
yes, yes, less
Yeah, thank
tension.
you.
So that's a good sign. But the only thing
Awesome. So
that is I
the
can
screen that I'm sharing is just for another presenter, but this will pretty great. It's done. I'm gonna ask you to do testing again.
But I'm not the first
Say
one.
something.
I think.
It's fine. They can stay up though.
Oh, really? So nobody else?
No one else has a hearing.
Okay. But then can you just go, maybe just go back to my name is
So you just only need this at the end.
Let's text each other. Hey, let's go. We're not going to go too early. It's not 2 a.m. It's not going to 10
Okay, 1 second. Just give me 1 second. It's fine. It's fine. 5 seconds again right now. Let's try. Okay, can you try again? Okay, so I can hear you on the screen. Okay, one more time. Beautiful. Yes. Yep, you're good. Success. Awesome. So then, I know you know how to use your computer, but your PowerPoint is here. When you know how to pull up your PowerPoint, it's under, let me make it super easy. It's right here. It's under Microsoft Edge. And you're just going to press present. It's right down here. But Monica will be here for that. Will I? Oh, is that your thing? Well, now I have to see that. I got it. Okay, do you have 5 minutes? Yes. Yes, but I can't. It's fine.
Okay.
I'll figure it out. You can copy and paste it after this.
Luis?
Is that fine?
Huh? No. I think we're perfect. Luis? Can I ask you for a favor? Are you good at photography? Because you're good at everything. So here's what I want. And I asked him to do something who's not here. And I assume he's coming back. But okay, can I tell you what it is? All right, so this is going live. It's going to start in 2 minutes. This is a perfect thing. It doesn't need to move. It doesn't need to move. While Wendy is not. But when Wendy is, this needs to move like this so that people can see Wendy.
Be out of the way.
I don't know why the video on her. Let's try this one. All right, it's much better on that one.
The screen.
Yeah, I want to get the screen.
But Wendy's not on the screen automatically?
Not on the screen. No. And then when she's off, move it back to the fore. So just, no, keep it like this. Keep it like this. And then it's this way, pivotal. This way, pivotal. You know, like whatever it is. It's like, actually, let's do this. So it's, like 45 degrees and then back again. And then take a few.
How about when you introduce Wendy? Do you want?
No. All right, let's just take some photos. You ready? I mean, please don't. I mean, it's not. I've been waiting. Let's do this.
All right, I think we're going to get started. This plenary has been a long time coming from a lot of different angles and perspectives, but it's exciting for me especially to bring it together on several levels. I'm going to do a little bit of light emceeing and moderating, basically introducing everyone first at the beginning, and even that in a kind of light form, introducing the basic topic and what we hope to do it and how we hope to do it. And then we'll hear from 5 of us, and hopefully we'll have a good amount of time, at least a bit of time to hear from all of you. My name is Matt Meyer. I am the Secretary General of the International Peace Research Association, but occasionally I do more than administrative work and travel agent work, getting people to places. If people were here for the last plenary, I'll mention I'm also occasionally known as Michael Myers' father. He introduced himself as occasionally being known as my son. Possibly and probably the main area of my work over the last years has been looking at some of the issues of strategies and tactics of 21st century, late 20th century movements for social justice, for peace, and for radical social change, substantial social change. And amongst the pivotal issues that I focus a lot of my work on has been the idea that nonviolence just doesn't work. The only way to make revolution is through armed struggle, and also that armed struggle doesn't really work at all. The only way to make radical social change is through nonviolence, and that you have to follow the path of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and you have to follow the path of Minister Malcolm X, Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, and so many dichotomies that many of us in this century, and even the end of the last one, have felt more and more don't ring true to us. They're false dichotomies. They speak to a reality of a time that may never have existed when one looks at history accurately, when one looks at resistance and civil resistance, when one looks at the way revolutions have always been made, with a multiplicity of tactics and even a variety of strategies, and also as a process more than simply a product or a date. And so in doing that, there have been certain struggles that have seemed key and core to that work, and to that thesis. It seemed much more that the idea of dichotomizing tactics and strategies and ideologies in particular ways was a penchant of scholars and activists of the global north, and that talking about these things for the most part in Africa, Asia Pacific, and Latin America was less radical, less weird, that people were like, oh yes, of course. Oh yes, of course we can be pacifists and have Che Guevara flags or decals on our cars and our whatever. Of course. And so it's a real honor for me, and I'm not going to read people's biographies or try to cite them, because you can look people up online. You know, we have the internet, and because the IPRA program has their bios in some detail. But it's not just rhetoric for me to say that the 4 people who are going to be the core speakers on this panel are some of the people who I most admire, respect, and love in this world of ours. And to me, those things are not, they're not coincidentally tied together. I use those words with great care and honesty. So in the order that they're going to speak, Wendy Elizabeth Marshall has been a friend of mine and a comrade and a challenging figure. You can
can see her smiling on screen there now. Since we were both undergraduate students, which is to say many years ago. And most recently, we had the sort of joyous possibility of working together as editors of a book that we have here. And that is only recently out, and that is not so easy to find, unfortunately, but Insurrectionary Uprisings, A Reader in Revolutionary Nonviolence and Decolonization, came out last year by Duraja Press. And amongst other things, it has in it some special new writings by Mireille Fanon, who is in the audience, Mireille Fanon Mendes France. And it has an afterword by a certain scholar organizer named Hakeem Williams. So if you really want to get your, get your copies and get lots of people to sign it, tonight's the night. And we'll have some copies available for sale cheaply at the end of this. I won't say more, other than that I often introduce Wendy as the most important Black liberationist scholar, activist alive in the US today who you've never heard of. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. Next is going to be Hoida Araf at the end of the table, and amongst many other things, a founder of the International Solidarity Movement, ISM, Palestinian activist, Palestinian American, and ISM has been so central to so many shifts within the US and internationally in building both solidarity, but also building strategies, nonviolent strategies, for an end to the settler colonial apartheid state of Israel and Zionism. Next, we have Mark Lance, who, when one looks quickly, can say by title is a longtime philosophy professor at Georgetown. But if you only said that, you would really barely be getting what he has done and what he does in life and in the world. And in addition to that, and lots of solidarity work and founding the Institute for Anarchist Studies, Mark and I also have been working on a book for, I don't want to say years, because if you figure out how long it took Wendy and me to edit this book, or how long it's taken Mark and me to write this book, it just seems depressing. But Mark and I are working on this book that looks less as an anthology of others' writings about this topic of revolution, nonviolence, and a decolonized world, and more as a book of our thoughts about what those concepts mean in this moment. So it's a book of new writings by the two of us. And finally, Diana Marcela Ortiz from Colombia. Again, one could look up her title and find out that she's a psychologist at University Externado de Colombia. She's also recently elected Secretary General of the Latin American Peace Research Council. But she's also an extraordinary activist, scholar, thinker. She's written and spent time written about in Palestine. She and I just were able to do an extraordinary trip in Burkina Faso. And I'll probably say a little more about that if you don't, when it's my turn to speak. But Wendy, Hoida, Mark, Marcela, extraordinary to have these people here together. And that's all I need to say by way of introductions. Thank you to all of you for coming. And beginning this open conversation between us and with you and with the world about strategies and tactics for social change and what these concepts mean of revolution, nonviolence, and what we need to redefine in this moment. Wendy, take it away.
Thank you. The thing about revolution I thought was emotional, political, and spiritual crisis that I've been in many ways based on the state of the world. So, holidays and very. So I'm going to start with this paragraph in my essay, In Black, which is something related to burden revolutionary nonviolence, in that nice edited volume, Insurrectionary. So, of course, myself. This is a message to warriors. The possibilities for nonviolent revolution rest largely in your hands. My native garden of capital is W.E.B. Boyd described as a psychological wage. The geostitution state-sanctioned extrajudicial murder, and the mail strike for continuing violence. But now, they're coming for you. Now, in the 21st century, capital has eschewed the bargain, and heard history. Many more of you are now on the economic front. Many more of you are experiencing dehumanization, degradation, premature death, and soteriological insecurity. You are made redundant by robots and workers in the global south. Your factories are shuttered, your labor unions are futile and ineffective. You are overdosing on meth, heroin, and pharmaceuticals, causing a startling rise in your life mortality rates. You rally behind a cheap slogan about making America great again, making America great again. Your wages stoked by white demagogues, whose job it is to distract you from the realities of the white working class life in a dying empire. What do you do with this? Do you cling to your whiteness, to your false and fleeting privilege, or do you lay your body on the line to learn and resist? Will you remain distracted from the reality that white supremacy is an elaborate game to subvert the power of the working class and unity across race? Or will you act to the occasion and practice the active solidarity and sacrifice needed for white folks to make on behalf of the black? And then before that goes. So I feel I wrote that into the fall 2018, which at this point feels very much like the distant past. Because since then, the white nationalists right in the U.S. has grown more militant and militaristic, even stating with no coup. We've suffered through 3+ years of pandemic, and despite the wisdom of the World Health Organization declaring anti-COVID health emergency, almost 350,000 people around the globe died of COVID last week. Other potential pandemic emerge, and we may very well be in the era of permanent pandemics, including zoonotic diseases like COVID, as well as bioterrorism and bioweapons. And it has become even clearer since the fall of 2018 the planet is suffering, the climate catastrophe is accelerating, and that life on Earth is ever more fragile. In my 2018 essay, I quoted the revolutionary George Jackson, who died in 1971, and who thought and wrote brilliantly about what it means to be human in a system of racial capitalism that wants you dead. Jackson was very clear that racial capitalism does not be defined away with peaceful protest. He wrote, the argument that the prestige of power will itself will let itself be educated away is too idiotic to be allowed to stand. Waiting for power to move to its inevitable class is suicidal for all concerned. In the last 4 years has taught me anything, it's that waiting for power to move to its inevitable class is not just suicidal, but genocide. And I want to stress the part about inevitable class, because that's clear, both in terms of the American Empire and in terms of the globe as a whole. Here is where we are, very clearly outlined by racial capitalist overlords and their military. Living to the sixth mass extinction, supported by fossil fuels and the imperative to profit. Literally inundated by rising sea levels, melting ice caps, and massive fires. Witnessing the steady march of fascism in the U.S. and around the world, buffeted by unprecedented diseases that stem from the rapacious cutting of primary forests, and Right, right. Last week, another black man in Birmingham was murdered on that train in New York City. He was murdered by a white former Marine in full view of an entire train car full of people. That makes me think that I cleared the white working class in my 2019 essay in the Marine. I wrote that nonviolence was only possible if the white working class began to understand how whiteness obscured its last centuries. Because violence is rooted, it's constitutive of racial capitalism. But from my vantage point in 2023, I'm overwhelmed with the existential threats arrayed against us, and I am not certain how we will survive.
Is it on? Oh, yes. Oh, wow, thank you. Thank you, Wendy. I think it's going to be a little hard to follow that. Let me stand. I'm used to standing. Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, or assalamu alaikum, as we say in Arabic, which literally means peace be upon you. It's how Arabs greet each other. I'm really honored to be here amongst you. It's actually my very first IPRA conference. I hope it's not my last, but it is my first, and I'm honored to be here to share a little bit of my experience and to learn from you and to strategize and grow with you. So my name is Huwaida. I'm a Palestinian American. I'm a human rights attorney. My parents left Palestine when my mom was 9 months pregnant with me. And they left because they were starting their family and they had no hope for Palestine. Unfortunately, they wanted their kids to be born in a country where they believed they could have a semblance of freedom and opportunity in their lives, which still to this day is not possible for Palestinians or not available for Palestinians living in occupied Palestine. Neither where my father comes from, which is inside Israel. So our village was taken over in 1948 when Israel was created, and they call us Arab citizens of Israel or Palestinian citizens of Israel. And Israel likes to proclaim to the world and to show us off as an example of Israeli democracy, how actually Palestinians are treated better in Israel than anywhere else. But we are a demographic threat to Israel because Israel considers itself a state for the Jewish people. And therefore, if you're not Jewish, you don't have the right to a national identity. You don't have equal rights. Yes, we can vote, but there are policies in place that keep us as a minority. So even our representatives in the Israeli parliament can do nothing for us. So many people say even that voting, having representatives in the parliament is a farce. There are literally 60 laws on Israel's books that you can look up that discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel because they are not Jewish. They stem from anywhere from teaching our history, you can get sanctioned, to laws that allow these committees, Jewish committees, to be formed to deny Palestinians the right to live in communities because we're not suitable, to denying villages municipal treatments, to moving whole-scale families and villages out of an area so they can develop it for Jewish citizens. That is, the best case scenario if you're a Palestinian there. Then you have Palestinians in Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza, and it gets progressively worse in terms of the rights that you are afforded, which are little to none. And so I was born and raised in the United States. But after college, I decided I wanted to move to Palestine for a little bit and see what I can do. I originally went to work for a conflict resolution program. We hear about these programs that are so great that bring people together so you can dialogue and solve the conflict, right? And this organization worked with youth, usually between the ages of 13 and 16. They're old enough to understand politics, but young enough still so they're not very set in their ways, bringing the kids together so they can learn about each other, break down stereotypes, build a generation, hopefully a generation that will create a better future in the region. That all sounds great, right? The problem is, we used to bring these kids together, And then when we take them home, we take the Israeli kids home to their cities or towns that are built on the ruins of Palestinian villages. And then we have to take the Palestinians home through winding roads and checkpoints, and then they'd have to walk through checkpoints under the gun of Israeli soldiers, and those Israeli soldiers very well might be the brother and sister of their new Israeli best friend, in these dialogue sessions. And these organizations, these dialogue organizations, do nothing to address the system that tears people apart. It's not that Palestinians don't like Jews or that we are inherently violent or have horns or anything like that. And actually, a lot of kids became really best friends. But when these organizations shy away from doing the political work to dismantle the systems of oppression, then they are not doing. It's a feel-good program that you could say you have a friend from the other side. And then they become actually counterproductive because they are used as an example of what you should be doing instead of the strategies of resistance that the people under occupation want to undertake to overcome their oppression and to achieve their liberation. And so, for example, in this program, when I wanted to take the kids to see and to sit in solidarity with a family whose house was going to be demolished because Israel announced they were going to demolish, and Israel demolishes Palestinian homes on a regular basis, that was too political and I couldn't do that. Needless to say, I left that organization and I co-founded the International Solidarity Movement. The International Solidarity Movement came about because am I allowed to move or should I stand in front of the camera?
No, you're fine.
So when
It would seem wrong to say you're not allowed to move.
When the second Palestinian Intifada broke out in 2000, and I assume most people know in general, so I won't go into details, but the then opposition leader, Ariel Sharon, went a very provocative move, went up to the to Haram al-Sharif, the Muslims' holiest site in the region, bringing with him like 1,000 armed security guards. And this provoked Palestinians for sure, which Palestinians protested, and then Israeli security forces opened fire on them, so killing a number of protesters, which then sparked more protests throughout the West Bank and Gaza, and actually even inside 48. And the Israeli forces came at unarmed protesters with heavy military force. So within 1 month, in 2000, from the end of September to the end of October 2000, Israel had killed at least 178 Palestinian protesters with bullet wounds to the chest and head area. So an Israeli journalist actually wrote about it. It was a shoot to kill policy. It wasn't that they were trying to just respond to demonstration, or even if you want to call them riots, they were shooting to maim and kill Palestinians. And so these unarmed protests that I was taking part in because I was living there suddenly died down. In those in Palestinian society that had arms, the security forces and whatnot started using them to shoot at checkpoints, to shoot at settlements in a way that didn't make much strategic sense. You're up against one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and you don't have a military, you have old Kalashnikov rifles, but it was an act of desperation and resistance, but it also left a lot of Palestinians unable to participate in the popular struggle of the Second Intifada because most Palestinians, women and children and whatnot, weren't taking up arms. But it gave Israel the excuse then to use more military force against Palestinians. So they were flying their F-16s and their helicopters and rolling their tanks into Palestinian cities. And so more Palestinians were being killed. And then suicide bombings started. So our second Intifada became, they call it an armed Intifada. I was there thinking, what is my role now? Like, what can I do? And it was frustrating because the international community was blaming Palestinians. Blaming Palestinians and blaming Yasser Arafat because he walked away from the negotiating table. He went back to his terrorist roots and he started this violence instead of kind of negotiating, completely ignoring that we had been in a so-called peace process for over 7 years, over 7 years where Palestinians were hoping for a state of their own in only 22% of our historic homeland. Only 22% of our historic homeland. And during that time, Israel actually cemented more of its occupation and continued with its colonial policy. So it continued to steal land, to demolish olive trees, to build bypass roads for the settlements that they continued to build on prime Palestinian hilltops, denying Palestinians their resources. And so as this control was being further cemented, Palestinians were complaining, and we were told, oh, it's a peace process, it's a process, and so be quiet, not now. So in 2000, when these demonstrations, erupted, of course it was sparked by Ariel Sharon's visit to Al-Haram al-Sharif, but it was really a culmination of all of and a realization, let's say, that Palestinians they did not want to be part of this farce anymore of a peace process. This is not a peace process, and wanted to be heard. And that also fueled the demonstrations. But the mainstream media was reporting on it, like I said. Obviously, the powers that be, the United States and otherwise, everyone was blaming the Palestinians. And at best, the media was reporting it as, when Palestinians were killed in clashes, as if you had two equal sides fighting over, land, as if it wasn't a decades-long settler colonial project that we were dealing with, and Palestinians simply asking for basic freedom. So when we founded the International Solidarity Movement, for me, I was naive at the time, honestly, and wanting to, growing up, learning about and studying Martin Luther King and Gandhi, who we talked about when we talked about nonviolence, wanting more of that in Palestine and not actually realizing the history of Palestinian nonviolence, because it's not taught in your history books, right? It's not taught how during our first Intifada, Palestinians created these popular committees throughout the occupied territories and how they led a powerful unarmed struggle, creating underground schools when Israel shut down our schools and universities. How Palestinians, when they would go on strike, they would shut down everything, which kind of doesn't make sense. Like, why would you shut your own businesses and hurt your own economy when you're protesting Israel? But it was a way to say we are shaking off the occupation because Israel controls every element of our being, of our existence, even at the time when you open your shops and when you close your shops. So you would see at the time Israeli soldiers going and breaking the locks on shops to open them because Palestinians were taking back control, and Palestinians who had, extra locks would come back and close their shops, and if they didn't have extra locks, they'd leave their shops open, but they would not work. Again, it's a way of asserting that we are shaking off this occupation and being under your control, and many, many more tactics. Even when it came down to, Israel used to, and still does, implement sometimes these curfews where nobody is allowed to be out in the streets, and Palestinians used to tie cans on strings to cattails, so they'd have soldiers looking for who's in the streets when these cats were running down alleys. Very creative and strategic resistance. So almost every Palestinian male of age that I know served time in Israeli prison for being part of this popular unarmed resistance that you don't hear about anywhere, because you only hear about Palestinians and their resistance when they are using arms or firing a homemade rocket. I wanted to revive that kind of resistance. And so talking to people who led that back then, I got a very stark message from one of them saying, you're right, Hueda, we need to be resisting in this way, but my generation is disillusioned and tired, and so it needs to be the young generation. And we just heard from a young panel, it's inspirational and is the future, right? But she said it's the young generation that has to carry it forward. So inspired by that message, with some others, international Israelis and Palestinians, we launched the International Solidarity Movement, and the point of it was to call people from all over the world, come here to Palestine to see what is happening. And we didn't know if anyone would really come, right? It looked like a war zone on TV. But we had kind of dreams of a mass civilian army that would be able to block the Israeli military from invading Palestinian villages, from taking Palestinian children from their homes, etc. And we called for a campaign, and we didn't get thousands, but we got about 50 people that came to our first campaign. And we organized actions, and then those 50 people went back home and they told others, and the next campaign, 70 people came. And then they went back home and they continued to tell people and spread the word. And now the International Solidarity Movement is over 20 years old. We've had well over 10, we've lost count because we stopped keeping a database because Israel used to break into our offices and steal some things. But thousands and thousands from over 40 countries have come to the occupied Palestinian territories and stood with Palestinians. And what happens when you do that? Because Israel kills Palestinians with impunity. Nobody holds Israel accountable, nobody. And Palestinians are usually blamed for their own death. But when you have internationals standing with Palestinians side by side and marching, sometimes you can mitigate the lethal response of the Israeli forces. And so having internationals together with Palestinians can help provide like a protective accompaniment of sorts. And second, we were hoping to change the way the mainstream media reported on things. And that this is not, Palestinians wanting to drive the Jews into the sea or anything like that. This is freedom versus occupation, freedom versus colonization. That's what you have. And if you're on the side of freedom, no matter what religion, what country you come from, you can come stand with the Palestinian struggle. And we've had Israelis and we've had Jews from all over the world also come and help us deliver that message. And then Palestinians are so isolated. Internationals with difficulty can get in and out. Palestinians is difficult to travel, so we rely on those internationals to go back home and spread the word and start campaigns in their own country to change the policies of their governments that is underwriting Israel and what it's doing, underwriting Israel's colonial project and allowing it to continue. And then the fourth element of the ISM, and I think is one of the most important ones, is the hope that it provides to Palestinians living under this brutal regime that they're not alone, that people actually see and hear them and are trying to do something to change it. Because the situation that you live in when you're there is extremely debilitating. You know that there are laws on the books that are supposed to prevent against these kinds of things being done, and it's not implemented when it comes to Palestinians, and you feel like nobody cares, and you're up against one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and again, you're alone and nobody cares. So internationals leaving the safety and sanctity of their own home to come deliver a different message has been very powerful. Gaza, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but Gaza, we used to be able to send internationals to, and then in 2003, one of our colleagues was killed in Gaza when an Israeli soldier ran her over with a bulldozer as she was trying to protest the demolition of a Palestinian home. 3 weeks later, another colleague, so that was Rachel Corrie, who was killed in March of 2003. And then 3 weeks later, Tom Herndal, who was a British national, a photography student, who was also killed in Gaza. He was trying to move Palestinian kids out of the line of Israeli fire when they sniped him in the back of the head. Even though he was wearing a fluorescent jacket, and again, they were shooting at kids. He was shot in the back of the head. He lay in coma for 9 months and he died. And shortly thereafter, Israel killed another international, not with our movement this time, who was a British journalist by the James Miller. And so Israel was starting to get a little bit of criticism here for killing internationals. And so what they decided to do is not kind of own up or hold anyone accountable. They decided to close Gaza to internationals. Gaza is already closed to Palestinians, but now internationals can't even get in to Gaza. And then come a few years later, they tightened the restrictions on Gaza. So in 2006, 2007, now not only can people not get in and out with any kind of relative ease, but even the supplies that are allowed into Gaza are heavily restricted. Even UN aid trucks bringing aid into Palestine are restricted into Gaza. I don't know if you know much about Gaza, but it's a small strip of land, only slightly larger than Tobago, with over 2 million Palestinians living there. When Israel controls every single entrance and exit in and out of Gaza. It controls the airspace, the seaways, the land borders, everything. And it prevents things getting in like medical supplies. It restricts Gaza to 4 to 6 hours of electricity per day. How do you run a hospital on 4 to 6 hours of electricity per day when you can't get in machines, you can't get in certain medical supplies? And like, for example, let me tell you the story of Aisha Lulu, a 5-year-old girl in Gaza. Bubbly, bright, but one day she came home throwing up, and she continued just throwing up. Eventually her parents took her around. She was diagnosed with a tumor in her brain. They couldn't treat her in Gaza. They don't have the medical supplies because Israel doesn't allow them to import. So she needed to go to a hospital in Jerusalem, only an hour away. The Augusta Victoria Hospital was run by Palestinian doctors, the Palestinian hospital. She had to get a permit to leave. The Israelis gave her a permit to leave. They approved her permit, but they did not approve the permit for her parents to go with her. They denied all her aunts and uncles permits to leave, all the neighbors that applied. They denied her grandma. Then finally, an elderly woman that knew her aunt was approved to go. Aisha had never met this woman before, but she was forced to go with her in a taxi to Jerusalem to undergo brain surgery without her parents. Her surgery went well. They removed the tumor. The doctor said her surgery went well, but Aisha is calling for her mother. So the doctors called Gaza and said, you need to find a way to get here because she's deteriorating. Even though her surgery went well, she wants you here. They could not get to Jerusalem, only an hour away. Within a few days, Aisha stopped talking, and with tears in her eyes, she closed her eyes and died alone. That is the cruelty of Israel's policy towards Gaza. But when do you hear about Gaza? Only when Palestinians resist and fire homemade rockets, to which Israel responds by barraging Gaza with sophisticated weaponry. Just last week, 33 people were killed. Women and children sleeping in their homes because Gaza identified that men living in these homes were members of Islamic Jihad. And so their kids and their wives and their neighbors deserve to die along with them. Palestinians are expected to withstand this cruel and degrading situation that they're in and not resist at all. Who would do that? Would you do that? Would you live decades trapped in a small area, not able to control your own life, not able to protect your kids, not able to decide what you can eat for breakfast or dinner, because Israel controls what gets in, not you? Over 50% of Gaza is unemployed. 2/3 of Gaza are refugees from their original homes, which are only miles away. And yet Palestinians continue to resist nonviolently. We talk about nonviolent resistance. Just a couple of years ago, Gaza organized massive marches, unarmed, tens of thousands taking place and marching unarmed to what Israel has created as their prison. And what did Israel do? Station soldiers on hilltops and shoot at them like fish in a barrel, killing 17 on the first day. And yet Palestinians sustain these protests every Friday for 2 years, continuing to get killed and wounded and maimed. And who has been held accountable? No one. Supposedly the International Criminal Court has opened an investigation since 2015, and nothing has been done yet. Yet within less than a year, we have indictments against Putin and what's been done in Ukraine. But Palestinians, nobody is held accountable. And so when we talk about strategies and where we go, Palestinians have been utilizing nonviolent tactics for decades and decades, from massive boycotts to some of the things that I have talked about. But Palestinians aren't doing it, cannot do it, cannot rely on using these tactics in order to convince their colonizers that there are human beings and deserve human rights, because that's not happening. Unfortunately, the system and the dehumanization is so entrenched. Those soldiers do not consider Palestinians as human. What Palestinians need to utilize nonviolent, or what, I don't even like to use the term nonviolent, and I don't, because for Palestinians it's become such a negative word, not because nonviolence itself is negative, but because the world is always focusing on Palestinians as being the violent ones, not recognizing, not acknowledging Israel's violence with their weapons and Israel's violence on a daily, the structural violence. And so Palestinians are always looked at, and we had a brilliant presentation this morning by Aisha, so I won't repeat, but if you can look it up, I would definitely watch it. Why Palestinians are always expected to be the nonviolent ones. So Palestinians coined the term popular resistance, popular resistance, and Palestinians continue to engage in it. But they are also calling on the international community. And we do need the international community. We need to break the systems that contribute and enable Israel to continue doing this. And unfortunately, the country where my parents made the home, the United States, is the biggest culprit, because the United States continues to veto UN resolutions, Security Council resolutions, preventing any kind of action to hold Israel accountable. And then we continue to funnel billions of dollars to the Israeli military every single year. But there are things that we can do about it. And so Palestinians in 2005 launched a boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, and that calls on every single one of us to look how in our own communities we can organize to either boycott entities that support what Israel is doing, divest. If we look at our universities, if we're coming from these institutions, our states that have Israeli bonds or anything, so divestment, boycott, and then hopefully also push our governments for sanctions on Israel. That'll probably come last. But that is something that Palestinians have called for, and we've had many victories over the last few years. We need many more. But by doing these kinds of actions, Palestinians will continue to resist and use popular resistance. Just being able to insist on your existence, on their existence, is resistance. But if we want to end really what is no doubt now not only a settler colonial project, but one that has instituted a structure of modern day apartheid, which is a crime against humanity, and if we know that this is happening and we're doing nothing, are we complicit in that? If we want to end that, then we use where we are to educate, to speak out, and to engage in BDS. That's what Palestinians have called on us to do, and this is a strategy of popular resistance, while Palestinians will continue to insist that we're not going anywhere. But Palestinians are not, as much as they have endured, they're not infallible. They're not some mythical, people that can endure what nobody else can. But somehow they are managing. And if I'm gonna just end with one story that'll quickly explain, I think, or give you a hint of the kind of spirit, and that the Palestinians are not, and I don't need to tell you, I know I don't need to tell you, but because we've been so dehumanized, I think we're programmed to try to convince people that we are not, these animals. But in one action that I was doing when I was there, when Israel was building the wall, we were traveling to a village, because with the villagers, we were going to tie ourselves or chain ourselves to their trees, because Israel was going to uproot their trees, the source of their livelihood, for building the path of Israel's apartheid wall. As I was coming into the village, I could already see the trees that Israel has already uprooted, and it was devastating. And that the night before, one of my hosts, who was an organizer, was telling jokes and laughing, and I was really in no mood to laugh, and I just said, Sam, how can you laugh at a time like this? Like, you see all those trees in your villages that have already been uprooted. And he said, yeah, well, actually, those are my father's trees. Those are the source of my kids' livelihood, my kids' food. So yeah, I should be crying. But you don't let them take that away from us, Hoida, our ability to laugh and to live. And so they will continue to do that, and I hope you'll join the Palestinian liberation struggle. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm humbled and honored to be in the midst of these incredible people, to follow Wendy and Ueda. Matt said I should talk for 10 minutes about tactics of revolutionary change. That seemed like a complicated thing to do. I'm actually going to pick up on what Ueda was saying about our need to move across communities, to coordinate, and to work together, because obviously, if we see the evils of this world as involving these massive systems, capitalism and colonialism and militarism and all the rest, no one community of people is going to change that on their own, right? We're going to have to work together. And so I just want to I'm going to give you two sort of stories, real true stories, that illustrate a kind of strategic theme that comes out of the book that Matt and I are working on. I want to say that in the global north, in the United States especially, there's a kind of received picture of how you do coalition work. You start with a lot of meetings in which you develop a constitution and a 10 or 50 or 100-point plan. And then you get groups to sign on to that plan. And then you recruit some people, and then you do some actions with those people who have signed on to the Constitution and the plan. I don't want to say that's entirely wrong, but I think it's basically wrong. I think that's a good way to waste an enormous amount of time. And I think it misses a fundamental point that agreements we make depend for their significance on how well we know one another, and that the relevant way of knowing one another is through working together. Okay, so quickly, a couple stories to illustrate the opposite approach, the start with action approach. In 2014, Mike Brown was murdered by the police in Ferguson, Missouri. Shortly after that, two people, one of whom was an old friend and one of whom I soon got to know, Dave Ragland and Corey Bush, started a project in Ferguson that they asked me to be a part of. I'm not going to tell you about that project, but I'm going to tell you something that came out of the resistance. There was an insurrection in Ferguson. They carried on daily protests of the St. Louis area police for a year. They were hit with tear gas and rubber bullets, and people died, but the resistance stayed. A few months into this resistance, a really interesting thing happened. Activists in the West Bank saw what was happening in Ferguson, saw some commonalities, and so they wrote a letter to Ferguson Frontline, offering their support and solidarity, and particularly saying, here's our recipe for homemade tear gas masks. Maybe y'all can use that. Some months later, this led to a delegation going from Missouri to the West Bank. But sooner than that, the following thing happened. Ferguson Frontline organized an event. It's called something like Policing, from Ferguson to Oaxaca to Palestine. And they were going to hold this event in a Jewish community center that had been, it's a sort of a liberal institution that had long very strongly verbally supported the Black community and to some extent on the ground. But donors at this institution objected. And they sent them a letter saying they had to take Palestine out of the event. Well, I don't know if, Corey and other people like that have become rather more famous in the years since this, but they sent a letter back and said there seems to be some confusion. Y'all seem to think that you get to decide who our comrades are and what our positions are, and you're mistaken about that. And this became, made the press, and there was a rupture. There was a rupture between the sort of liberal Zionist Jewish community of St. Louis and the Black community. And at the same time, a growth of support. Muslims and Arabs and anti-Zionist Jews started showing up for the daily protests against the St. Louis police. And communities made connections that are still there, that are working on projects around homelessness and community violence and food insecurity in the suburbs of St. Louis, projects that bring together communities that had not had any particular connection to one another before. And I want to say this came out of kind of two letters, right? But the work those groups do together comes out of the fact that they stood in front of the police and faced the batons and faced the tear gas together and kind of knew they could trust one another. Okay, quick other story along these lines. When Donald Trump was elected, most of you have probably heard about the massive Women's March, the permitted legal march with hundreds of thousands of people. The day before that, there was a much more complex action. About 5,000 to 10,000 people from DC organized into affinity groups. And the mall, the National Mall in DC, has a number of entrances, like a block apart. And the way this worked was, no one thought they could disrupt the inauguration. That was obviously not going to happen. There were literally 25,000 police out that day. But we thought we could skirt the bounds of legality in such a way that our protests could not be ignored and that anyone going into the inauguration would have to see that there were people that opposed a fascist administration. So we formed groups around labor, environment, Arabs and Muslims, 8 or 10 different groups, the largest of which was the Black Lives Matter group. And each one took an intersection. So we were a block apart. And we all did our own thing. And at the end of it all, we all agreed we were going to march to the BLM Plaza and join together in a kind of celebration of unity. So I was with the Arab and Muslim group. So the first part of the story is just emotional. We're marching down Independence Avenue. We turn, we see, there's about 300 of us. We see about 1,000 African-American DC residents. We all start chanting Black Lives Matter. And as soon as they hear that, the BLM people start chanting Free Palestine. And we marched into each other with this counterpoint of chants. And then everyone hugged, and it was, it's what we anarchists call prefiguration. It was kind of beautiful. The second thing, I immediately had a conversation with April Goggins, who's one of the leaders of DC Black Lives Matter. And she said, you know what happened 2 hours ago? There were some Nazis showed up, some actual neo-Nazis, whose goal, quite explicitly, was to disrupt these protests and spur a violent incident that would lead the police to arrest everyone. So about 15 or 20 neo-Nazis with pipes started marching on the Black Lives Matter group, chanting racist slogans and the like. And then like 50 of those kids, those white kids, the ones who dress in black, showed up with baseball bats and charged at the Nazis and said rude things like, we're gonna fuck you up. And the Nazis ran away. And the anti-fascists followed them. And I don't know what, in the end, whether the police arrested people or not, because it happened, whatever happened in another place. And BLM managed to continue what they were planning to do. And my point is, this is diversity of tactics. But it's diversity of tactics in a way that don't compete with one another, but that make others' actions possible. And that's like the coda to that is that about a year later, there was actually called for a very large neo-Nazi march in Washington. And I was asked to facilitate some discussions between different groups that wanted to confront that in very different ways. There were people that wanted to have a massive festival to show the diversity of the city. BLM wanted to march on the same route as the Nazis without permits, not instigating violence, but ready to defend themselves. Some anti-fascists wanted to fuck them up. Some other people wanted to do some rather subtle civil disobedience actions of various sorts. And the question was, can we pull all these groups together, let them all do their things in ways that make each other more powerful? And we had some fairly secret meetings. People came into the room that had never been in the room together. And I want to say a lot of those people were there because of what happened at the inauguration, because they knew that they could sit down with these people and talk to them. And we did, and it was a brilliant day. In the end, we had about 15,000 DC residents and about 40 Nazis showed up and in the end ran away. So it was cool. But people did all of these different things. Okay, so short version. I want to just sort of suggest we think about the idea that if we want collective actions across community groups, the way to start it is with collective actions across community groups. We don't need to agree on all of our political principles. We don't need to know how the whole revolution is going to be charted out. We need to start by fucking showing up. Sorry, I curse a lot. It's just me. We need to show up. Because it's not to say that discussion and principles aren't important, but principles that are shared by people that have had each other's back in dangerous circumstances mean something entirely different from principles that have been written down at the end of a conference. Dialogue between people who know that each other are willing to put in the work is an entirely different thing than, a couple kids being friends, right? All right, so that's a lot more could be said about that. And I can say some more about it, but I'll stop with that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm really honored to be here to have this conversation with you, but also with all of you. So thank you for coming, wherever you're coming, because this is an important conversation that we need to have, not only today, but among these days. You know what really pisses off Israeli people? That Palestinians continue and keep existing. They keep existing. They are trying to raise them, and they exist. And that's so fucking annoying for the Israelis. And as I was hearing about your description, I was thinking also in one of the keys I want to share with you. Because I'm Colombian, my name is Marcela Agudelo, and I think I'm in this table more because of the redefining, because I'm not sure I do know much about strategies, but I feel like I can hear about what you've been saying, and also because as a Colombian, I had to go to Palestine, to Palestine, to understand my own questions. So when I was visiting Palestine and looking at this exact thing that you say, resist to exist, I was also thinking about my own story. So I want to share with you some reflections and some connections and some articulations that I have been doing because of my work. And because of that perspective, I will tell you more about myself and what I do and where I come from. So I want to take just 3 different approaches. And the first one is the ontological perspective. And why the ontological perspective? Because I don't think I can talk without saying a thing or two about me, but not about me as Marcela, but about Marcela as an historical subject and a product of an era. And I come from Colombia, but coming from Colombia means also coming from a never-ending violence, never ending. So I don't know what does it mean to live in not a violent context. I won't say in peace, because that will be wrong. But I don't know how could that be. I don't know, because I come from a territory that's taken for the narco traffic. So when I hear you say, okay, Israeli people controls everything, yes, they do. Also narco traffic controls everything in our lives. Even though we don't see it, even though we live in cities, even though we think it's really far from us, it's not true. And we have to recognize this, because this makes other categories has no meaning or no any sense anymore. Democracy, citizenship, in a place where narco runs, there's none of those things. None, because they're taking everything from us, everything. And that's exhausting, because yes, we are under threat all the time. And that experience of being aware of that is complicated, but I always tell this short story, not that we're telling stories. I was doing my master's in Ecuador, and then I was looking through the window, and I don't know if you have been to Quito. Quito is a wonderful place, it's very boring as well. Nothing happens, nothing at all, it's just like quiet, there's never too much people gathering around, and I was just looking through the window and listening to the radio station or whatever, they were talking about the long-lasting violence and whatever. And for the first time, I was already, I don't know, more than 20 years old. And they said this about the most long violence ever, blah, blah, blah. And of course, they were talking about Colombia and somebody else's experience. And just then I asked myself, I don't know, how is living under these conditions where there's no violence such as in Colombia, where there's just people, living without all these kind of critical situations we have. And I had no answer, but the problem is not, I had no answer, but I couldn't even plant the question, because it's so hard. It's so hard to think outside the context where you come from. And I will explain more, and hopefully it will make sense, because I'm a psychologist and I work with this. And this is very important. But there's also this thing about social mobility, that it's, we've been talking about this in little pieces. But in Colombia, I say also the hiding your roots career, because we all live in a context where, well, we've been told that being indigenous or black or peasant is something we should be ashamed. There's no one feeling proud about coming from the rural areas, because you should ascend in the social mobility career. But this is not just because people is trying to be mean and tell you that you have to do it, but because our fathers and our great fathers has been telling us they really want us to have a better life. And they really do want us to have a better life, because what they met in their stories was poverty and misery and exclusion and marginalization, and they do not want us for us. But that also means for us to forget about our roots. If we were coming from Afro-Colombian or indigenous families, let's keep that in the past, because you're now under better circumstances now. You have access to university, for example, that for us in Colombia, that's a key point in the mobility scale, because once families like mine thought, okay, so now the children has gotten to university, we're good. They made it, because that somehow was the idea of ascension, but also is the idea that now that you're at the university and in the city and you live in Bogota, so you can forget about whatever parents or relatives you have from other places. And that has deep implications on what I want to say. And then also, being a woman, well, I'm going through this very confusing time. I was listening to the plenary carefully, and yes, it is a confusing transitional time through generations, and it's particularly confusing for women, particularly special and important, and I do believe future is female, but it's also transition. So my father, sometimes I cannot stand to be with my father because I can't stand the way he talks to my mother, and he loves her, and she loves him back, but I cannot stand it anymore because we're under this transition, and it's a cultural transition. So whenever I hear my students, my female students, I see them struggling because we building relationships now is something else. Now, in my generation, we're even thinking about our previous relationships and saying, "Hi, what is this? What was that? What does it mean to us?" So that's the ontological perspective. But then I want to talk to you about the epistemological perspective. Because as a psychologist, I work in a university. I do not believe in psychology, I have to say. I hate psychologists most of the time and in my life. I know many. I know there's good people and well intended, but also psychology has been all the time like really far from reality, in Colombia particularly, because they haven't thought it was important to say anything. But we've been under war, internal war internal conflict, for more than 60 years. How can we do not have anything to say? I don't understand. And now, well, it's complicated, but in this kind of psychology I work in and building, I guess, cultural psychology means understanding that we as a subject are made out of our cultures, and cultures are networks of meaning. And meaning sometimes, like now in Colombia, in Palestine, in the States, everywhere, is complicated because we're sustaining complicated ideas, and capitalism and colonialism and racism is not a cloud that comes after us. It's the way we do things every day and the way it's inserted in us and in our practices. So what this all means, and why do psychology like this needs to go through ethnography just to take the semantics of the action, but then also the hermeneutics, the critical hermeneutics, because we need to listen to ourselves and to our stories and try to understand what does all this means. When you say what you say about yourself and myself, where are we? Who are we? And this leads us to the intersubjectivity threats, because I truly believe, and we were talking yesterday in the circle and in the space we were working, whenever we talk about ourselves, we feel somehow that we are too personal and the important things and are, unmasking capitalism and unmasking the way racism operates. But that's all of those structures operate in our lives and the way we relate with each other and with other people. So these threats, it's important to follow these threats. Where were you when you were born in Chicago? And where were you when you were born in the States, not in Palestine? What happened there? What happened to your family while they were there and not in Palestine, etc. And then I had a master that always told us that it's important to regain the world in the subject and the subject in the world, because these are not disconnected things. We have social big structures that are the continuity of subjectivity structures. We do not have sense or make any sense out of the social structures we live in. And what does that mean for me as a Colombian woman from this era that has to live in a country that goes under narco-traffic ideas? You know what? There's a person writing in between the States and Mexico, Sayat Valencia. I don't know if you know about her, but I really like her ideas, because she said, you know what, most of the time when we are in academic spaces, people tend to think we are it's not overreacting, but we are exaggerating, because of the kind of violence we have to go through is just so dimensional and unbearable and I said yesterday, and I will continue saying I don't want to talk about it, because then I will break, because what the things that happens, like in Palestine, happens in Colombia every day as we speak. So there's people coming into houses and going out in pieces, and I cannot, and I don't want to talk about that, because it's not, I don't want to. In Mexico and wherever the narco is, this is a profoundly dark reality. This is an awful and broken world we're talking about. This is a crisis, as it says in the table, because we are not just like creating new spaces in new eras in Colombia. And I will say, the people that expect us from Colombia to talk about peace because we had a peace process with the guerrillas, I'm sorry, that's not happening. I'm sorry, I'm going to tell you about something different. But then regain this world in the subject, and the subjects in the world is also make us also think about histories made by humans with good personal stories, right? And we need to connect those. So that takes us to the political perspective, because all this is are connected, of course. You know, ontological, epistemological, and political are not separated, of course. They just point at different kind of specifics. So one important thing for me to say is that we need to think not for our disciplines. I don't need to create more psychology. No, I don't. I don't need to raise any kind of discipline. I need to think, because my reality is so complex and so confusing and so painful that I cannot stand thinking anymore to create more academy. Yes, I work in a university, yes, but I need to find some answers, not for the other people, but for myself as well. Because what we are going through is really fucked up, as you described, as you all know, but maybe you don't know. I don't know. I don't know, but what we're going through is really messed up. So I have no time to think for academy anymore. I don't. I need to think for the life I'm trying to build. So in all this perspective, what does subversion means when we want peace? What does that mean when we come from this peace agreement process in Colombia and everybody's happy to talk about peace and finally we are, what does that mean when you have to stand and you have to be against not only paramilitarism but also the guerrillas? Because in Colombia we have to fight them both, because everything is so confusing and so exhausting and so touched by this narco way of building the world that is very confusing. There's no right and left anymore. That's just a reduction of the complexity we're living. So it's not, it's a never-ending cycle. So what does that mean to us? Where is the right to think subversion in the middle of a process when everybody says like, okay, just stop it, we're in the middle of a peace process. It's not allowed to talk about subversion because, we're tired of that. But are we tired of subversion? Or what are we tired of? You know what I mean? Because then it became important to say, well, maybe I don't feel comfortable with this kind of peace because, you know what, we lost FARC. And now in those territories, we have narco dealers taking the territories that have been guarded for the old guerrillas. Am I standing for the guerrillas? No way. not also. But how complex this is, It's very confusing, I'm going to say again. So what does that mean to be subversion and to have subversion under your questions of life? Of struggle, not as an intellectual, but as a life question, all right? And then, we have this thing that living under technology and under social media and whatever, so became somehow these very good clients and spectators. So we see reality as we see television. So we say, I don't like that, as we can change channel. We can't change the channel. But I mean, we need to stop complaining as, as it fit. Oh yes, awful, what's happening in Palestine. It is awful, what are you doing about it? Because we cannot just be complaining and being spectators without, go and get some dirt, I think is the word. So stop complaining and start acting. And I want to close with this image that I just saw. Well, this phrase I saw yesterday here, the conference, at the opening, and I really liked it. And I know I'm bringing very, very, very dark context and ideas, but I want to say this. What does this mean? Being a living ritual, what does that mean to our lives? Even though we come from these very, very complicated places, we also shine because we know how to laugh and to dance and to love. And we have been fighting to this monster that is as big as Israel. When are we going to defeat Israel? That's going to be tough. When are we going to defeat the narco traffic? I don't know, because they have all the money in the world. I don't see that happening. I'm sorry. But does that mean for us to stop fighting? Why? So what's the solution? What can we do? So are we just letting us be consumed by this? No fucking way. We need to be a living ritual, and thus this means to understand where are we and which are our means to connect with others that brings solidarity and bright and light into our lives, because our lives are really, 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 really dark, and we need to start connecting the dots, and the dots might not be, we have to continue struggling with the structural, but maybe we also have to bring light to the people we are more close to. And we are close now here in this conference. We're with people that's coming from everywhere, just to hear about Palestine and to hear about Colombia, and what do you want to do now that you have all this information? Do we want to gather in 2 years to say how bad it got from here? I'm sorry, I do not want to do that. I didn't came to here just to do that. But we need to think more strongly. And the young people were saying in the previous plenary, we are fighting with the same beast with different heads. Yes, we are. But we need to continue and to recognize that beast. So this being a living ritual has a lot to do with what we've been experiencing here in Trinidad. And I want to say this now, yes, for finishing, that I'm absolutely impressed on the dignity of the people from Trinidad and for what they do and what they're showing us. And just because of that, coming here is worth it, because it's so dark what we live that we need more of this. As I left Palestine after writing something on describing all this, the psychological mechanisms of occupation, I think it's called the paper. But then I felt it was unfair also, because it's only showing how mean came Israel and how mad, the madness of Israeli people is doing there. But it's the same frustration I feel when I talk about Colombia and I just talk about the narco traffic that is so real. But you know what? There's also the magic that's among us that we have to continue to build as a ritual for life, for defending life, because we don't have anything else. We just have ourselves. All right? Thank you.
So, this is not easy to follow these four people. I just want to say, by way of accounting for administrative instinct, we have gone over time, and I'm not apologetic for that. I think many of you know we have a sad piece of information not relating to this plenary, that the great Don Rojas, who was to be with us at this time, at this moment, has taken ill and is not able to be with us. And we decided as organizers we're not going to fill in this blank. So in fact, this is the last thing happening today, so we are able to go over time a little bit. We understand some of you cannot, but those of you who can, we're here. I'm going to try to be brief and try to say something intelligent, which is really hard in the face of the extraordinary four that presented before me, but I guess I'll say this. They asked Bertolt Brecht if there would be singing in dark times, and he said, yes, there will be singing, of course. They'll be singing about the dark times. And that's where we're at, it seems to me. And it's noteworthy to say yes, in a way, at a moment. Marcela was to be facilitating the plenary tomorrow because of particular work she's doing that connects with the issues of redefining genocide that Mireille Fanon and Jihad Abdul-Momid and Luis Rosa are going to be talking about. And then the person who is going to be with us and another person had scheduling conflicts, so we moved things around. So in fact, yet, the connections, the connectivities between what Oeda said and what Marcela said and what Wendy said and Mark and what I'm going to say, it's clear that we're not talking about coincidence and we're not talking about well-planned everything. We're talking about moments in time. We're talking about a historic moment in this time where we, those of us who are academics, need to be better social scientists. The crisis of the moment requires us, demands of us, to be better social scientists. Those of us who are organizers need to be better organizers. We need to be more precise, more distinct. We need to be better studied about the movements we build. The movements we study and write about need to proclaim the voices of those. We don't need to tell their stories anymore. Not one more story told from someone about someone else. We need to be better historians, not telling other people's histories, but giving them voice, space, stages, microphones. We need to be better at what we do. We need to be doing more together. I talked about disciplines and interdisciplines. I talked about why this is relevant for the Secretary General of IPRA to be doing. Why is it relevant? Don't worry, I'm not slipping. Why is it relevant for a peacenik, a longtime pacifist, to be wearing, or alleged or apparent nonviolence leader, to be wearing a t-shirt that has the face of Amilcar Cabral? And a quote from Cabral, the military commander of the liberation movement of the peoples of Guinea-Bissau. It's because amongst many of the genius, prefigurative, I don't know what that word means, the amazing, thoughtful, visionary writings that Cabral said decades and decades ago, the most famous of which is the speech where he said, we have to be honest with the people about everything. We have to tell no lies, claim no easy victories. But that's not the quote on my shirt. The quote on my shirt is from that speech, but it's a different quote from that speech. And it's a quote that for me summarizes part of the task that we have at this moment. The quote says, we must be militants, but not militarists. We must be militants, but not militarists. And if we don't understand the difference, if we don't conceptualize what that means, if we can't understand those nuances, then what are we doing? Saying that we're learning from history, or studying from the past. We're actually listening to the people we're sitting next to. What does that mean? It means we're not listening. And so it doesn't take just reading from, great scholars or activists from 60 or 50 or 40 or 30 years ago. It doesn't mean to say we killed Martin Luther King in 1963 with I Have a Dream, because we don't quote anything from 64, 65, 66, 67, or 68. It means we say, as some of us have written, we refuse to choose between Martin and Malcolm.
We refuse to choose and say you have to do one or the other, because if you look carefully and closely, those people were much more connected and growing more connected and had to be killed in some ways because of that connectivity and closeness. We have to do better, a new generation of connecting, not of figuring out the reasons to disconnect. We have to refuse to choose between Gandhi and Che. And so when we talk about, on the more positive side and the more modern side, what it is we have to do, I'll end by I'll start the end by going back to what my sister Wendy said about nonviolence and about whose responsibility and what it means in this moment. Because obviously the study of unarmed tactics and nonviolence and what some people more and more call resistance. And the reason why, in addition to IPRA, my other tag is with the Resistance Studies Initiative, is because it's obvious on some levels that the penchant, academically and otherwise, for saying in a world of extraordinary and profound violence, at a moment of violent crises against the people of Gaza, within Colombia, where you have a higher chance of being assassinated as a human rights worker than you do in the Ukraine, the war against the earth and the climate crisis. At this moment, when it sounds like being nonviolent means telling a kid who's picking up a stone against a tank, that's an act of nonviolence and violence. When the guerrillas of Colombia put down their arms, that's a headline about violence and nonviolence, as if now the problems are solved, and they were never solved at those moments. Then we're not defining nonviolence in a way that makes any sense in the world today, not any sense. It has to do with some, at best, highly theoretical, utopian, and really very, very northern and white version of what social change means. Which is why, again, some people are using the word resistance, which is a lot greater, or at least unarmed struggle, at least more comfort than this word that we've used about nonviolence in the shape and in the time of a world of great violence. So it's why some of us went to Burkina Faso a couple of months ago to proclaim, or to witness, to become students, though we are professors, and to witness the new movements of people who are supporting again, rebuilding the movements of someone like Thomas Sankara, who on the one hand was a military leader, but much more importantly was about building grassroots local civil society, especially focused on the leadership of women and the leadership of workers. To see a new generation of people, including in many, many women leading in this new generation, a Sankarist movement that connects to the government, but isn't necessarily only about the government, much more about the grassroots, that's a place of hope. What some of us did in Juba at the African Peace Research Association, what we did in Chile at the Latin American Peace Research Association, and looking at some of the French and Portuguese African countries, the movements of today in the Andes, in Zapatista, etc. This is where I think we can locate hope. If we're going to cut past the dark times, this is where we can locate hope. This is where little insurrectionary uprisings, not the revolution that's going to save the world or even save one country in it, but little connections between us that we deepen, that we grow. This is why in the US I work with Jihad Abdul-Hamid, the Spirit of Mandela Coalition, that both on the one hand looks sharply at US human rights abuses genocidal policies, as was proclaimed by an international tribunal, which Maria Fanon was part of, and you'll hear from them and some of the other jurists tomorrow. Genocide, ongoing genocide of US government against its own Black, brown, and indigenous peoples. In the context of that horrible negativity, we also have the beginnings of coalitions, the beginnings of connections between diverse peoples within the US empire. That's the only thing that gives me hope about my own country. This is why internationally we have an Occupied Peoples Forum, and you'll hear from Luis Rosa later this week about that as well, from Puerto Rico. And peoples of Palestine and Puerto Rico and Western Sahara and West Papua and Kurdistan Rojava and Kashmir. A new Occupied Peoples Forum coalition that Resistance Studies and others have been supporting, who on the one hand are not about to see victory tomorrow. Puerto Rico is free. No, we don't expect that. But in talking to one another, in talking across these geographic lines and these different histories, there's this renewed interest in what unarmed tactics might mean, in what building civil society and civil resistance what mean. Is it a nonviolence movement? No. Is it an armed movement? No, no. Is it new movements to build new solidarity? And if those of us who are not under direct military occupation today are not deeply in solidarity, what Hueda said, then what are we doing? What are we doing saying that we are professors for peace or even justice? It becomes nothing but theory. And we're done with theory. It's 2023. We're done with theory. The times are too dark to continue to be theoretical. But in these connections, in this work, and for me, in building this organization, IPRA, I find a little bit of hope. Thank you. Okay, so now I don't know what to do, because I can't switch from that to being an administrator, MC, whatever, and it's 7:22, and we can take some questions and answers. As far as I'm concerned, from 8 minutes till 7:30 or 38 minutes till 8 o'clock, I'm up till midnight most nights. I mean, whatever. Let's at least start by taking some questions. Let's help facilitate one another so I don't have to just pretend to. Like someone says, oh, it's too late, we should stop. Who wants to start? And Wendy, just wave at us when you want to get in on this that as well, okay? All right, who wants to start? Questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, objections, critiques? Complete love and excitement of what we said. Wendy, are you raising your hand for complete love and excitement, or was it the critique part that I didn't raise your hand? Go ahead. Okay, I think you're muted.
Yeah, it was the critique part.
Go ahead, please.
I guess I have a couple of questions, particularly, I've been an organizer since I was 17 or 18, and I'm 61, so that's like 40-some years. And I have come to believe that the tactics and strategies and practices we have inherited are not sufficient for this moment. And so one question I have is for Mark, in terms of all those things that happen at Trump's inauguration and the counter-Nazi marches, like what's the hope that comes out of that? What is that supposed to achieve? So we can answer that in a minute, but I just want to see this. A meeting I was at earlier today, with the new generation, we asked ourselves a question about what was the horizon of our struggle, of our political work. And it was really interesting across age to hear the different answers. But for me, the horizon goes from the time before Europe to the extinction of humans on planet Earth. And so I sometimes feel frustrated by the lack of, we can talk
you, so thank you. Sorry about the non-interactivity of that.
Thank you very much, and especially to the first speaker who spoke with great passion and knowledge. I wonder if you could just comment. Do you think that it's necessary to have an idea of the end game? Is it a two-state solution still, or is it a unitary state? And does it matter if you that you have an idea of where you are going or not?
Couple or just?
If there's another one now, well, yeah, let's go back there.
Okay, I'll just very quickly say, Wendy, I think I came across as more literal than I meant. You may notice I'm wearing a mask in here. That's because, okay, well, no, everyone else notices that I'm wearing a mask in here. And it's because I have a genetic condition that's deteriorated half my lungs. That's made a difference in the kind of work I do. I'm not literally in the street facing tear gas because tear gas will kill me. Not maybe, it's pretty straightforward. We can stand with people by making their food, or by watching the children, or by doing the transportation, or by writing, or by, there's all many ways that we stand together. That, we all hopefully understand that the network of support that's needed to build things is more than just the people who walk out in the street and fight the Nazis. You asked what I hope to gain. I was merely trying to suggest a kind of programmatic route to trusting one another enough that we can start to build coalitions. Now, you also, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with you that the tactics we have used are not in the last, 50 years in the global north are not remotely serious if we actually want radical change in the world. We need to build for systematic labor strikes. We need to build for massive shutdowns of multiple cities at the same time. We need to build for all kinds of things. And, we could talk about those tactics in the long run. But in order to do that, we need people working together. And in order to have people working together, we have to trust one another on a level that doesn't come merely from talking. And that's what I think the point of showing up and working starts. It's just a start.
Thank you for that question about the one state or two state doesn't matter. All right, first of all, I never talk about it in terms of one state or two state, because I believe that takes it out of the human rights framework. And I think that that's a framework that we have to have, because when we look at the two state, solution that's been talked about, that includes Israel's demand that the world recognize its right to exist as a Jewish state. So then the policies that exist that I talk about towards the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or anyone that's not Jewish living in the state, they will never be equal. They will always be a demographic threat. And that's something like, even if there was a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza tomorrow, my struggle would not be over, because I'm still not an equal citizen inside, my country, the village, and where my parents and grandparents came from. And so I think the two-state solution was never adequate in terms of guaranteeing human rights and equality for everybody, irrespective of religion and ethnicity. And that's what I think we need to focus on, a human rights framework. And I would urge anyone to not get sucked into, because our political leaders or those representatives always like to talk about the two-state solutions as if it's still alive or as if it's adequate, and that also distorts things, right? It's as if these two sides need to come to the table and decide on, where boundaries need to be. When you have a situation of of colonialism. You have a settler colonial regime here. You need to talk about decolonizing first. When you have apartheid, you need to talk about dismantling apartheid first. Then you talk about, what kind of system or government or state or how many states you're going to have. But you have these structures that exist. You can't be calling the colonizer and the colonizer to the table to negotiate away, because there's no equivalence in terms of power. And then again, you still have, you need to talk about dismantling that system first, which the colonizer doesn't want to do, which they need to be forced to do. But when you bring them or talk about bringing them to the table, it's as if you have to negotiate, well, what are you willing to give up? And that's usually nothing. So I would encourage anyone working on Palestine, or as you move forward, or as you talk, to completely get away from this two-state framework and always put it in a human rights framework, and always talk about the need to first decolonize and dismantle apartheid before you talk about how many states you're going to have for people. That is absolutely critical, in my opinion. But you are right in that, when you look at studies at Gene Sharp and all the people that write about like strategic nonviolent resistance, you always have to kind of know the end game so that you're not sucked into, look at what happened to Egypt after they overthrew Mubarak. Look at what happened to Tunisia now. Look, almost every kind of revolution, when you don't really have a plan for the end game, then the revolution can be stolen from you. So there is that issue. I'm not saying it's not important, but what Palestinians are thinking about right now is liberation. What they've always talked about is not, I don't know how many people know this, but the political program of the Palestine Liberation Organization historically was one secular democratic state for everyone. And it was only until the late 70s and early 80s where they started talking about, accepting a two-state solution and whatnot. But now people are getting back to forget the two-state solution first. We want a situation where everyone can live with the same freedom, human rights, and dignity. And that's what, that's the call from Palestine. And as solidarity activists, I would think and urge you not to get drawn into that. That leave to the people there, the Palestinians, and just focus on a human rights framework.
Any other questions?
I want to say something. I think when people
Why
talk
don't you
about,
wait so we can hear you?
I have a pretty loud voice, so.
But why is far away?
She wants.
She'll hear you.
We'll hear you if you.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I think it's instructive when people ask, and I can understand if you don't really understand it. I've spent quite a lot of time in Gaza in the West Bank, but I actually lived there a few months at a time for 5 years in Gaza. Is that it really is very instructive. Look at a map why the two solution does not work, apart from what Huwaida had said about the two-tier judicial system, which is, and if, everyone has their own interests, and we can't all be knowledgeable on every issue. I certainly am not. But I did, from living there and then also being an academic and focusing on Middle East, North Africa, and Swana, as I call it. It really, if you look at the map, is really for it's just they've eaten up between all their expansion, eaten up practically all. Forget about historic Palestine, but that was gone a while back in '48. They've eaten up any semblance of a two-state solution, because it's just like cottage cheese. You have like where Palestinian villages are, and if they're not already extinguished and gone, you have all the settlements. So it's impossible, and if you see that map, then it becomes more of a reality. That's all I have to say.
If I might, I'll just add a question too, Anthony. And thank you all for your presentations. It's, I think, very stimulating and provocative for the work that needs to be done. And in that spirit, based on the discussions we've been having all day, it's pretty clear that peace is incompatible with capitalism, right? And Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdish freedom fighter, talks about freedom is incompatible with the state. But for the conversations that we're having here, I wonder if peace is compatible with the state. And I would kind of like to hear your reflections on this as we're discussing strategies and tactics for what we're calling peace, because I'm not even sure like that we're all sharing a definition of that, but it would be really interesting, I think, to maybe open it up in that regard.
Thank you. I want to do a little reading of the room. Unless I'm mistaken, I didn't see any hands up for further questions. And we have a comment that's gone not responsive, but one can respond or not. And a very provocative question that could be the title of its own series of plenaries. That said, somewhere between we're tired and ready for dinner, or we want to answer Anthony's question in full, perhaps the moment now is to ask each of the speakers to quickly do their last comments, very quick last comments, very quick last comments. I'm not timing you, but I'm just saying quickly. And as much as you want to answer Anthony's questions and or say anything else, please feel free to do so. I'll start this time. I think the time has come, again, as IPRA and as peace activists writ large, peace and justice studies, professionals, etc., to understand that amongst the incompatible isms that we have to look at, not just sexism, heterosexism, racism, imperialism, but yes, capitalism itself needs to be confronted as a system. Now, what that means becomes complicated because we're also looking at building real-life alternatives, and then there's this anarchist thing, and there's socialist thing, and there's this communist thing, and maybe there's something called democratic socialism, and maybe you can have a mixed economy that has a little teeny bit of capitalism. What does it mean to have mixed economies? That's where the question becomes a book series. I mean, I think about books, maybe it's a series of TikToks, I'm not sure. But the fact is that looking at confronting capitalism as a system that has as its roots exploitation, oppression, is clear. But then it opens up the question, like, for example, we can talk about the complexities of Palestine and then somehow go off here and have a conversation just about the 1 or 2 state solution. Nothing but that, which is okay, but we begin to get to the point of saying, how do we disentangle ourselves from the need for a particular dogma? And I think we're also at a time when we have to be at the end of dogma. So, for example, yes, some of us, including people who are not anarchists, or at least not card-carrying anarchists, whatever that is, I haven't seen the card.
It's a secret card, man.
I thought so. I knew that something was being kept to me. I felt that all along. But the fact is that the problematic of the state is on the table. The answer's not there, but the question is front and center on the table. So the era, for example, where the national liberation struggle was the pinnacle for some of liberation, of revolution, of freedom. Support the Front for Liberation of the People of Mozambique. That's where I learned my stuff. Guinea-Bissau and Cabral, national liberation was the pinnacle of revolutionary thought. And that moment existed, and that moment is no more. So the clarity that at this moment we have to look at stuff that's not, at least not all state-based, is clear. What replaces that, anarchism, something decentralized, is not so clear. But what we have before us as we're trying to go deeper, as we're trying to, as I called for, be better activists and academics, is to not shy away from those questions and not shy away from potentially radical answers.
I thought you said you were going to be brief. Okay. It's a complicated question in our case as well, because what happens when it's the state that kills you continuously? Because you have to know, as Colombians, we keep asking who gives the orders, and normally it comes from inside. So, but okay, I want to bring briefly to different scenarios. I work in Chocó. That might be one of the most violent places where the state has never been, never ever, just the military. It's different. No education, no health services, no whatever. But I also work with the government now because we have this national law protecting victims and restoring rights to the victims from internal conflict. And if it is not us and the Commission and Justice and Peace, there's no one coming because there's no one standing for the illegal groups being there. So we need to bring the state also. But then you have the indigenous communities, and the indigenous communities since 91 that we changed constitution and we recognized our diversity, they all started claiming and fighting through the means of the state. But where does it puts the question for autonomy? Because then if everything has to go through the state, well, the state is not willing for them to live and to organize and to stand for themselves. One thing is recognizing rights, and one very different thing is you can do just what the state allows you. So I will close with this. I think we need to build within the state, out of the state, and against the state. All of those, not only one, because it's useless.
I agree with the last thing you said. I'm a pragmatist at real heart, and we should do everything we can to make things better. But the answer to your two questions are both yes. Look, they just are, right? The state is the institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. That's its definition. How could that be compatible with peace or nonviolence? The state organizes society around a structure of orders that are enforced through violence or the threat of violence. They can be the nicest laws in the world, but we're still organizing us with a set of orders that if you don't follow, you get thrown in a cage. Fundamentally, one has to believe there's better ways for humans to organize themselves than that. It's not just a matter of making the orders be somewhat nicer or somewhat more equitable. It's a matter of whether we can find ways to live with each other through something other than orders. I can talk to you. We can figure out how to live together. I don't have to say, I will throw you in a cage if you don't do it right. And that is to say, and Matt introduced me as the village anarchist, but that's what anarchism means. It means finding ways to organize society through things other than authority and coercion. And I think it's absurd to claim to be opposed to violence and not want to do that.
Okay, those were just 3 brilliant interventions or responses to that. So I'm going to use my quick, whatever time I have to mention something that I neglected to mention in my talk. And it's one of the things that we did to try to break the siege or the inhumane blockade on Gaza, and that is ongoing. And I have a comrade here, Stellan, who was part of it with us. But if you heard of the Free Gaza movements or the flotillas, we started sailing boats to Gaza in 2008 through international waters, and the point was to stand up to Israel's policy of closure. We weren't going to back down. We were going to take these 2 dilapidated fishing boats that had kind of peace activists on it and sail in international waters to Gaza. And if Israel was going to stop us, they were going to have to use force against to stop us, which we hope would then expose to the whole world that Israel's policy towards Gaza is not about security. It's about persecuting a people, trying to bring them to their knees for political gain. That was in 2008. We sailed a number of times, culminating in 2010 when Israel attacked our flotilla, killing 10 of our colleagues. but the initiative continues. The initiative continues, although I'm not directly involved in organizing anymore. I just wanted you to know if you want to get involved. An initiative launched just a week ago, I think, in Norway, but if you can Google or look up freedomflotilla.org, a number of groups now are starting to sail to various European ports to draw attention to, build solidarity, build awareness, and then the goal is to next year sail then to Gaza. So freedomflotilla.org, because Gaza is unlivable and everybody is ignoring it. We have to do what we can to bring attention. So I'm talking about all of liberation for all of Palestine, but it's especially dire in Gaza and people feel abandoned. So this is one initiative you can get involved in, freedomflotilla.org.
When did your comment? It looks like you have the last word.
So first I want to ask, how do we make things better? And second, I was looking really big on what's happening there about Gaza. And the record of social revolution, taking over and running the state is not particularly positive. That's it.
All right. We have to build it to make it more powerful. Thank you for your time. We will sell copies of the book at greatly reduced prices and continue here in this conversation over this week and otherwise online. Wendy, we wish you were here with us, but we can continue this conversation in more ways than just in person. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you.